So I think we are just going to go to CTO gears and what do we do? So I think the basic thing is, as Dr. Souvik has already said, I think it's setting up the case, and it requires you to do some planning, get some hardware in with you along when you start. Earlier, we had we have to cut out your guides when you're doing an anti-grade to get your retrograde gear now. But now you have these short guides also, so you don't need to necessarily cut your guide anymore. You need to have your guides with side holes and have to have the long sheaths also. So if you have tortuosity in your femoral arteries and you don't have a long sheath in place, you've crossed the artery and then you're struggling to get your material in. That doesn't make much sense. So often making sure that you have a good access, making sure that you have long sheaths when you're using a femoral access is something that's imperative when you're setting up your case. I think it's all comes down to guide wires, and I think it becomes quite murky and quite dizzy. I think if I just put up this slide and I say we have done the work. So this is how our mind works. When we have guide wire classification, we have all these wires and we really don't know what to use, when to use. I think it's important to just stick to one or two wires. So do not try and fill your brain with too much of wires. Be comfortable with one or two wires and then use those wires and get more comfortable with it. It does not mean that you necessarily have to know all these wires, to have all these wires in your shelf. And I think just to start off, I think there are 4 important features which are required for our wires. We need to have a coating wire. So when you have these polymer coating wires, they give you the slippery feeling and they help you to pass through these small micro channels. And then there are these channels which are, these coatings which are hydrophilic and hydrophobic, and these work over the working tip of the wire. And then there are the core material. You need to have the core material to understand. And I think the best example of this is the Gaia wire, which does not have a transition. It is just a single core as compared to the other wires, which often have a transition, which makes it difficult for you to have a torque response. And you must know the tip strength. You must know the tip load of the wire, because as you escalate your wire, if you don't have a good penetrating force, you need to do a wire escalation, and you escalate in terms of your wire penetrativity also. So when you classify them simply into two major groups, one is a polymer coated wire and one is a non-polymer coated wire. And the polymer coated wires are the ones that we use, which have a polymer jacketing. And what it has is that it makes it very slippery. So you can get your wires in, but then again, it loses your torque control. So you do not have much of a feel. It will just go through, but it does not give you the feel or does not give you the tactile sensation. And therefore, it's good for tortuous lesions or lesions where there are microchannels. So when you have a microchannel, these are the wires, or the polymer coated wires are what you'd want. But then you don't want it for the calcific lesions or the dense fibrotic lesions, because what will happen is that they'll deflect off the calcium and then they tend to go subintimal. So before you've started a case, if you have a sudden subintimal passage, then you're in a false playing field right from the beginning. And so you don't want to do it for cases where you have dense calcium or calcification. The other group of wires are those we talked about, are the non-polymer coated spring tip wires. And here again, you have two types. You have the hydrophobic and the hydrophilic material coating. And these are the ones that are useful for the calcific or the blunt tips where you really want to penetrate. And again, these are the ones which are also good for the parallel wire technique. So you've got your wire down to one of the false lumen. And now you want something that gives you tactile feel, something that lets you penetrate rather than the slippery wires that you would have. And again, amongst these are the 3 ones, as I said, hydrophobic, hydrophilic. And again, these are the ones, Crusade and the Miracle series and the hybrid series, or the Confluenza, the Conquest Pro. So again, I think what comes down to the tapered versus non-tapered. So when you have a small micro channel, to have a tapered wire sometimes make it easier for you to enter these channels. But if you have a blunt of a non-tapered wire, sometimes it just makes it difficult. And therefore, the tapered wires are the Fielder XT and the Confluenza series, and these are the ones which make it easy. So again, broadly classifying them, I think this is the slide that I look for. A hydrophilic wire is one where I'd use for a proximal tortuosity. It gives me a good feel. It does not give me a feel, but it slips through. And again, it's good for the micro channels. And a non-coated wires are ones which I'd use for blunt tips, where I need good control for parallel wires or something that will give me a good torque control. The wires, I think in the earlier days, we had only very few wires. The Pilot series was one that used to struggle with. But again, I think the Gaia series has made life very easy for all of us. And I think all of us have benefit from these wires. The advantage of these wires is the ability to torque these wires. So if you've gone into the false passage, you can always pull them back and get into another lumen without causing too much of a problem. And again, I think you must know about the first, second, and the third, and the tip load of 4.5 grams with the Gaia third. And it has what we call as the slip coating. And this also makes it easy for us to slip through the lesions. So again, when it comes to antigrade, I think Dr. Souvik has already shown us, this is what I would look at. If I have a start with a Fielder XT, and then if I have a vessel with a known course, I would want to go with a tapered, a stiff wire. And if I don't know the course, I want to be ambiguous. There, I may not want to take a very stiff wire. I would take a wire which is softer because I can do a knuckle with this wire. So a Pilot 200 or a Fielder XT are the ones which are normally used for retrograde knuckle also, or an antigrade knuckle. So there you would want something that is softer. And for my retrograde, this is my escalation. So I start with the Fielder XT and then escalate to a higher wire. And then if you want a penetration at the end, you'd use a Conquest Pro. So we have the wires that we talked about. And then what we come to is microcatheters. These are also extremely important for us. There are many roles. You can use it for giving a strength to the wire tip. So you can use it for increasing the pushability of a wire. It also helps for wire exchanges. It can do a wire exchange with it. You can use a wire reshaping with it. You can do microchannel injections. You can use it to dilate the channels also. And again, when you're doing a retrograde, you must get it across the septal to prevent the septal from laceration. So again, this could be a simple, a huge list. You start from the general use. And as Professor Panja said, you have the fine cross to start with. The over-the-wire balloons is something that is not used anymore, but I think in our old days, this is the balloon that we used to be dependent on when you were doing a CTO. And this is the only balloon that we had. It had advantages, but it had certain disadvantages. The advantages was because there was a balloon, you could use it to dilate the channel also. But the disadvantage is that it could not be torqued. Now, with most of the micro catheters that we use two types. One is the basic, which is a non-braided. And this is what Professor Panja was referring to, the fine cross of Terimo. It's been there for many years. The only difference or the disadvantage that we find is that it's a non-braided. So you cannot torque it when you want to rotate and push it ahead. It is not good for torquing. You cannot push it ahead. So it has to be by push and pull rather than by rotating or torquing, which is the advantage that we have with the other braided microcatheters. So the braided microcatheters have made life easier for us because it gives you the advantage of pushing ahead by torquing. So the Turnpike series, the Turnpike spiral, the LP is used mostly for the retrograde and for the antigrade also, but it's mostly for the retrograde. And the Corsair series. Now this is again, the Ashai guys have done a wonderful job in getting us these wires and these microcatheters. Now you have the Corsair Pro, and you can look at the distal shaft. It's just a 2.6 compared to a fine cross. But the advantage of this is, as compared to the right side, you can see this. It has a very tapered tip. So, and the proximal part where you use it for torquing, that braiding is much better as compared to a fine cross. And then you also have the caravel that can be used. Now the caravel is usually used as a retrograde. We usually use it for retrograde. Again, you can see that the crossing profile is very, very small. And again, this is a non-braided catheter. So when using a caravel, again, it's a push and pull or a seesaw technique rather than a torquing technique. And again, you have these Corsair Pro XR XS, which is the latest of the series. We don't have it in India as yet, but the Corsair Pro XS has the benefits of Corsair Pro along with caravel. So you can do, it has a braided along with a very, very small tip crossing profile. And so this is what would be a great leveler in terms of crossing. Other than that, we also have the Mamba series from Boston Scientific. The advantage of Mamba is that it has an integrated tip. So unlike the Corsair and the other ones which have a different tip, so when you're doing a extreme torquing, you can sometimes be fearful of breaking off the tip. Where the Mamba is one continuous tube, it does not break off because it's an integrated tip, and therefore that concern of breaking the tip does not exist with the Mamba. The other thing that you also need is for device for exchange, and this happens when you have because you're working on single length wires. And there's a dedicated balloon which is known as the Trapper Exchange balloon from Boston, and this is much. It has a 2 French diameter, so it's much thinner than even a balloon, and it can exchange from a 6 French. You can have a 2 millimeter balloon to a 2.67 balloon for an 8 French. So this is a dedicated balloon for exchanges. And again, you can have another one which is known as the trapping balloon. And there's something known as the trap liner. So a trap liner is a combination. It has the benefits of a trapping balloon along with an extension catheter. So the proximal part of the balloon has this balloon in the bit part, which can be used for trapping. And this is it has a guide liner in the tip. So the same balloon can be used to get a guide liner as well as exchanges without the need for an additional balloon. And of course, 1 minute. The old days that we were doing the hydro method of removing a wire. Well, this is not so much encouraged anymore because you can lose your wire at this stage. The other wires are the twin pass wires and the other catheters that Dr. Qubix has already talked about. We have the Sasuke and the Kaneka Crusade, which are also used for exchanges. And of course, I think this has been extensively spoken by in my last speaker. You have the crossboss and the stingray. And again, as he said that you must realign it to the way that you can see the artery and then do a puncture. You must have bailout devices also with you. So one must have the coils and the covered stents and the pericardiocentesis the kit along with you. Of course, making sure that you use all these methods to break out your techniques. And emerging guiding catheters can also be used to get a good CTO puncture, even ambiguous caps. You have the Atlantis from the Boston Scientific, and you have the Volcano from San Diego. The advantage is that the solid state or the Volcano has a short tip. It has a 10.5, unlike a Boston, which is a 23 millimeter leading tip. So these are some of the catheters that can help you in your procedure. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your patient hearing. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.